Buen día, alumnos. ¿Cómo están? Espero que estén bien. Me llamo Asen y soy su profesor de español. Les doy la bienvenida al canal. Y para mis suscriptores, qué alegría volver a verlos. Hoy hablamos de vocabulario y las palabras en español que ya sabemos, aunque tal vez no sepamos que las sabemos. That's right, I'm talking about cognates. So let's get to work. Now, before we dive in, I want to let you guys all know that you can learn directly from me, either in a solo or group setting, to help target your desired areas of growth in the language. I would love more than anything to personally assist you in your language learning journey and get you up to speed on absolutely anything that you want to know about this beautiful language known as Español. If you're interested, you can scan the QR code up on the screen or use the link down in the description. Slots are limited for private sessions, so make sure you get in quick before they run out. Alright, with that in mind, let's get to learning. The stories behind English and Spanish becoming the languages that we speak today have a lot in common with each other. And as such, they have a lot of words in common with each other. Although there are some differences between these words because they follow different spelling and pronunciation rules, the good news for us English speakers is that Spanish is a phonetic language, which means that it has very specific rules when it comes to spelling and pronunciation. The point of this video is only to teach you how to arrive at the proper spelling for our cognates. But if you've already seen my video on Spanish pronunciation, you'll know how to say all of these words too. Although cognates are pretty easy once we understand the rules that take us from English words to their Spanish counterparts, there are a lot of rules. And I'm not gonna lie to you guys, learning them all can be pretty dang overwhelming. You're in luck though, because Profe Austin has developed a PDF document that breaks down all of these cognate rules, and you can download it for free using the QR code up on the screen or the link in the description. I'm going to go through most of these rules pretty quickly today, but the more complex ones will get some more time devoted to them. Now, before I can get into the specific rules for getting to our cognates, I first got to discuss certain spelling changes we have to remember when turning English words into their Spanish counterparts. These rules apply to the entire Spanish language, not just the cognates that I'm going to be talking about today. Spanish spelling isn't redundant like English spelling is, so it doesn't use letters unless they're actually pronounced, meaning double letters generally get reduced down to just the one. Now this applies to all English words with a Spanish cognate if they use a double consonant such as a B, D, F, P, S, or T. Now the double M is a little trickier. Spanish cognates will have the first M replaced with an N as long as that first M is used in the prefix im, but the rest of the time the double M is reduced down to just one letter. Now there are three sets of double letters which might be retained in their Spanish cognates, but not in all cases. With double C's, if both letters are used to just make a hard sound, Spanish drops that second C. However, with the double C, oftentimes keeps the same spelling in Spanish as long as each C has its own sound, with the first being a hard sound and the second being a soft sound. Now the double L is used only when the English word carries that same y sound after, because it's the same sound that's used in Spanish. But that's very rare. As a matter of fact, the only two words I can think of right offhand are billiards and brilliant. Now the double N is most often reduced down to just one letter, but it is sometimes retained when the cognate uses the prefix in, such as innecesario and innato. Now, the last double consonant I'll discuss is the double R, which is always retained for cognates and uses that trill sound I talked about in my pronunciation video, such as horrible and error. If you want to know how to easily make that trill sound, go check out my pronunciation video with the link up top. It's a lot easier than you might think. Now, before we can get into our cognates, there are a few other changes we need to know about. Spanish doesn't use PH in its spelling, and that F sound instead just uses a single F. The same goes for TH. Those words in Spanish drop the H because that th sound doesn't exist in Spanish, except for soft C's and Z's in most of Spain, but that's a whole nother matter. One last thing, English words that start with an S followed by a consonant will add an E at the front of the word for their Spanish cognates. Okay, so now that we know all of our English words and how they need to change their spelling when we turn them into their Spanish cognates, let's get into the meat and potatoes of this video and talk about the rules that tell us which English words actually have Spanish cognates. In case you're wondering, there are generally estimated to be about 20,000 English to Spanish cognates. Now, the rules I'm going to share with you all have to do with how the word ends. So I'm going to go through them in alphabetical order by word ending. However, I am going to break this up into 3 sections. Cognates which share the same exact endings, cognates that slightly change the ending, and cognates that change the ending completely. I'm also going to point out whether these rules are used with nouns, verbs, adjectives, or adverbs. Now, before we start, a word of warning for you guys. There are a decent handful of exceptions to these rules, and I'll share some of the most common ones on the screen as we go through. I'm going to go through most of these pretty quickly, so make sure you've got that PDF handy if you want to follow along more easily. Now's your last chance to go ahead and download that. Alright, so let's start with the cognates that have identical endings in both languages. Firstly, nouns and adjectives ending in AL in English will also end with AL in Spanish. We also have the same endings for words ending in AR, which are usually adjectives. English words ending with BLE, which are usually adjectives, are also going to have the same ending in Spanish. And lastly, nouns ending in OR in English also end in OR in Spanish. Alright, so let's get a little more complicated with our cognates and talk about the endings that change slightly. Going again in alphabetical order, English nouns and adjectives ending in ARY end in ARIO in Spanish. Nouns and adjectives ending in CT in English end with CTO in Spanish. English verbs ending with E oftentimes replace the E with an AR or IR in Spanish. And nouns and adjectives ending with IC in English end with ICO in Spanish. And they always stress the syllable just before ICO. We also have nouns and adjectives ending with ID in English, which end with IDO in Spanish and stress that syllable just before the ending. English nouns and adjectives ending with ILE end with IL in Spanish, and in many cases they'll stress the syllable just before the ending, but not in all cases. Next up, we've got a pretty big one, which I'll go more into detail in a little bit. English nouns ending with ION will become feminine nouns ending with ION using an accented O. But if the word ends with TION, that T is swapped out for a C. Now make sure you remember this rule for when we revisit it later. It's going to really come in handy. Moving on, nouns ending with ISM in English will end with ISMO in Spanish. Nouns ending with IST will end with ISTA in Spanish. Now most of the time these will use the article la, they'll be feminine. But when they describe people, they'll use either L or la, depending on the gender of the person they're describing, but it's always going to end with that A. Next up, adjectives ending with IVE will end with IVO in Spanish. Nouns ending with MENT will end with MENTO in Spanish. And English nouns ending with NCE will end with NCIA in Spanish. Most often, these are words ending with either ANCE or ENCE in English. And then we've got nouns and adjectives which end in NT, which is usually ANT or ENT, which end with NTE in Spanish. Now, I've got one more which is kind of an oddball before we move into the cognates that totally change the ending. English verbs which end with a vowel, then a consonant, then a T, will add either an AR or an IR in Spanish. Probably my favorite example of this is eructar, which means to belch. Now, you might be wondering, Austin, those two words look nothing alike. What are you talking about? Well, just go ahead and Google synonyms for the word belch, and you'll see exactly what I mean. Alright, now let's get into our last sets of cognates where the ending completely changes. Firstly, English adverbs that end with ly are going to swap that out for mente in Spanish. Be warned though, most adverbs in Spanish come from adjectives which aren't cognates. Now you'll be able to better tackle that issue after I put out my video on the link between nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. So if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time to remind you to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you'll know every time I drop a new video. Moving on, adjectives that end with OUS will swap out that ending for OSO in Spanish. Nouns that end with TY in English will end with DAD in Spanish and will all be feminine nouns. Lastly, adjectives ending with Y will end with IO, and nouns ending with Y will end with either IO or IA. The nouns ending with IA will oftentimes break the diphthong at the end and accent the I, creating two syllables for that ending, especially with fields of knowledge such as biología and fotografía. All right, now before we get into our practice section, let's revisit that TION to CION with the accented O rule that I talked about earlier. Like I mentioned, that's always used to describe nouns. If the noun uses an A before the ending and it has a related verb, we'll drop the CION from the Spanish word and replace it with R. In English, these sort of verbs are generally going to end either with ate or ify. Sometimes it can get a little tricky, but if you can think of an English verb that has an accompanying noun ending with TION, you can almost always arrive at the proper cognate. I'll give you a few examples. To verify is verificar, because the act of verifying is known as verification. Another one, to pronounce, becomes pronunciar, also following the same principle from the word pronunciation. All right, now these rules are so solid that in most cases you can use them to learn new words in English too. For example, the Spanish word canción means song. Well, have you heard about the English word canción? It's a more antiquated word, but it means song as well. Just keep these rules in mind going forward, and you'll know thousands of Spanish words without ever having to look them up. Don't forget, there are plenty of examples of false cognates, and the free PDF I'm giving you for this video is going to include a bunch of those as well. Alright, so now that we've gone through everything that we need to know in order to get our Spanish cognates, let's get started with our practice round. Now, I thought it would be fun if we do something a little bit different today. Do any of you guys remember doing Mad Libs as a kid? I used to love filling those out when I was younger. If you don't know what they are, they're short stories that leave certain words blank for you to fill out. And you can make the story say, well, all kinds of silly things. So here's what we're going to do. If you look toward the end of the PDF document, you'll see I've got 3 pairs of Mad Libs, each with an English and Spanish version. I'm going to put up the English version on screen, filled in with words that have Spanish cognates, and I'll put up the Spanish version without those words filled in. It'll be up to you to fill in the Spanish version with the correct answers. Now, you are expected to conjugate verbs in their proper tense, but I'm willing to give you credit if you can pick the right verb in its infinitive form. I don't want to overwhelm you guys too much, so each Mad Lib is going to have 5 words for you to translate. So that's going to be a total of 15. You got this far in the video, so I know you're serious about learning Spanish. So I'm confident you'll get all of these right. Just like always, this practice section is open book. So jump around the video or the PDF document as much as you need before you decide on your answer. ¿Estamos listos? Empecemos. Here's our first Mad Lib with our words filled in. So, what goes in the blanks in the Spanish version? Alright guys, 1 down, 2 to go. What goes in the blanks in our next Spanish Mad Lib? Alright, last one. Can you fill this one out? Alright, so how'd you do? If you got all 15 answers, this is for you. If you missed any, don't worry. Like I mentioned, we're talking about learning around 20,000 words here. So it's pretty much impossible to never get just one wrong. Oh, well, alright guys, It sounds like that's all the time I've got for today's lesson. I hope that you've enjoyed and that you've learned something valuable today. If so, don't forget to show your thanks with a like and let me know if you're interested in learning directly from me. Thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you even more for staying through until the very end. Que pasen un lindo día. Adiós!